Good.
Everyone ready from a camera standpoint? All right, we'll turn it over to Mike.
Everybody good? Okay, here we go. The Oklahoma Administrative Procedures Act required the Oklahoma State Board of Education to follow its internal rules and procedures in developing, proposing, and adopting the new social studies standards. They did not. The standards now have the full force and effect of law as a result of the legislature's silent acquiescence. The APA required internal rules and procedures of the State Board regarding the standards to ensure that a fundamental right is preserved under our Constitution, due process. This legal principle requires adequate notice and an opportunity to be heard. This lawsuit challenges the legitimacy of the State Board's adoption of the standards on that basis. Simply put, the State Board broke its own rules and ignored due process. The plaintiffs in this case, my clients, are Oklahoma citizens. They're parents, grandparents, and teachers who believe that due process should always be the bulwark of governmental action in our state. They are not asking for money damages. Instead, they are seeking a court of law's review of the circumstances under which the standards were adopted to determine whether they were legally before the legislature. We intend to call as witnesses in this case each member of the State Board, Superintendent Walters, State Board of Education staff, and other individuals involved in the development of the standards. Our goal is to get to the truth of things. This is a profoundly important undertaking. My clients believe the citizens of Oklahoma and the legislature need to know the facts and the evidence relating to the impropriety around the adoption of the standards. This case will decide whether we are a society bound by laws or a society in which might makes right and the ends justify the means. Happy to answer any questions.
Is there anything in this lawsuit that challenges the content of the standards, or is it solely focused on the process that produced it?
The lawsuit is focused on the process, the procedure by which the standards came to the legislature. We do mention the inclusion of a passage in the standards that relates to the 2020 election. We do mention that.
Is there any specific element of maybe what went wrong that you were really zooming in on? Is it a matter of whether it was posted publicly in the proper time, or whether the board members were properly notified of changes? What in there are you really
I think the last thing you mentioned is the most important thing. There was, again, based on the good work of the media, there have been concerns that have been written about and described in a first-person basis by State Board of Education members. So it's our belief that the process was flawed. The APA requires them to follow their own internal process for the standards, and therefore the standards are not properly, lawfully before the legislature.
Question.
Yes, sir.
Public radio. Is there something that you don't know yet that you expect to find out through this lawsuit as far as the process goes and how it all went down?
Well, that's why the lawsuit's being filed. You know, there's certainly a lot of suggestion, and there's certainly a lot of commentary that causes us to believe there's a lot more to the story. So it's always helpful to have witnesses who are testifying to things under oath, again, to get to what I'm referring to as the truth of things.
Do you plan to ask a judge for a hold on the standards so that they don't go forward and through to schools before the lawsuit's over?
We're going to be back before the judge this afternoon asking for a temporary restraining order to keep the standards from going into effect while this lawsuit's pending.
If you
Yes.
could share what have been some of the direct concerns coming from the plaintiffs, so parents, could you share what they're saying to you, what they're concerned about with
Yeah.
those
So there are estimates that I'm aware of. There are over 800,000 young people in Oklahoma schools. That's around 20% of the population. These standards have the force and effect of law, and the fact that these standards are going into effect without being properly reviewed and adopted are of great concern to my clients. They want their children, their grandchildren, and their pupils to be educated in a way that's consistent with the law. And in our view, and again, we're going to be in court with this, the law was not followed. Other questions? Over here. Oklahoma County.
Do you know the case number?
It was assigned to Judge Dishman, so my assistant is bringing copies of the petition. The petition and the exhibits were around 3 inches thick because we included the online standards and the standards that were before the board later. So we should have copies of the petition here in the next few minutes for everyone, but again, we didn't include the exhibits. We'll PDF this and make it available to you later in the day, so you'll have the whole thing. Anybody else?
You said you're going to call as witnesses individuals who were involved in developing the standards. What do you expect them to testify about? And also, I'm curious how many plaintiffs you have, or how many clients are you having?
We were still talking to people about whether or not they were willing to be plaintiffs last night. We've got somewhere between 7 and 9 at this point. And then with regard to your first question, you know, I think this process should be examined from alpha to omega. So having people who were involved in the development of these rules, there were requirements that needed to be met along the way. So again, not to belabor the point, we want to get to the truth of things, and anybody that has been in the process that has relevant information, relevant evidence, testimony, we want to give them the opportunity to provide that to the court.
Is this the first legal challenge that you know of to academic standards? Is this precedented at all?
I don't know the answer to that question. There certainly have been challenges to administrative rules over the years in the state. Whether the social studies standards have been challenged in court in the past, I don't know. You had a question?
Is the executive committee, which was made up of folks from outside of Oklahoma, mostly, Craig Review Heritage Foundation, is that part of your lawsuit or a concern that you're looking into?
Our principal concern is the meeting in which these standards were adopted and then transmitted to the legislature. So that's going to be the principal focus, I believe, of the case and the inquiries that we make.
Those rules sat in the legislature for a couple months, if I remember right. Is there a role in your mind of something that the legislature should have done in response to their constituents?
Well, I was in the legislature back in the 80s when God was young. And back then, there had to be affirmative approval of the rules by the House and Senate, and then ultimately the governor. I think that's a good practice, particularly given the fact that you're allowing something to go into effect that wasn't reviewed extensively by the legislature, and it's a law. As I said, it affects over 800,000 young people in the state. So my advice to the legislature would be change the rules back to the way they were to ensure that when a rule is going to become the same thing as a statute, that it's carefully reviewed, and we've all got confidence, people have confidence that things aren't going into effect automatically. So that would be my advice if I'm asked. Yes?
You mentioned the focus is on that meeting where the standards were adopted, but you also mentioned that in the lawsuit, you mentioned some of the standards and details. Are you asking the court to review any of the details within the standards, like the 2020 election curriculum?
Well, the substance of the standards has certainly been a point of discussion and debate. Again, thanks to the good offices of you and the media who've been covering all this. With respect to what I've been asked to do by my clients is they want the procedure reviewed by a court of law to ensure that these rules were properly before the State Board of Education and properly transmitted to the legislature. And it's our belief that they weren't. So with regard to the substance, other than the mention that was made in the lawsuit, as you'll see, requiring students to be taught about the 2020 election, our petition mentions that, but the focus of our lawsuit is the process. Back to you.
I'm not clear on whether you're alleging that the board voted on a set of standards that they had in their possession to review, and you're alleging that the standards that were sent to the legislature and the governor are different, in there's substantive differences between what they thought they were voting on and what they
I think that,
voted on.
again, based on what I've learned and based on the coverage of the meeting, there are a lot of questions. One State Board of Education member in the minutes was indicated to have made the motion. She denies that. There is clearly a difference between the standards that were online and the standards that were brought before the board. And you've got board members saying these are different from what we've been suggesting, what we've been communicating to people are the standards we're going to vote on today. So, you know, back to due process, and you all don't need a lecture on constitutional law today, but that's just inappropriate. It's inconsistent, we believe, with their internal procedures. And, you know, you've got to allow people in a deliberative role. It's democracy. You've got to make sure that they have the ability to understand what they're voting on. And so the hiatus there is the standards that they were voting on weren't the standards that were being represented to the public as before the board. There was definitely a delta between what was online and what was before the committee that day, before the board. And, you know, the reason we have rules, particularly in a democratic legislative setting, is that at the end of the day, due process is followed. Adequate notice and an opportunity to be heard. And I think that what happened failed that test. Anybody else? Yes?
Are any of the board members plaintiffs?
Are any of the board members plaintiffs? No. Yes?
Have you had to have discussions with them? Have you talked to them at all? Given the fact that you did mention that this was mainly focused on procedure that happened in that meeting, but there was that first person reservation concerns from within the board members themselves?
I haven't talked to any of the board members, and I haven't talked to the superintendent. But I will.
One more question.
One
Have
more
you gotten any support from other lawmakers with this case that stand with you and what you're presenting?
There have been a number of lawmakers who've made public statements indicating concern about the procedures, how the rules were adopted, so Republicans and Democrats. So it's really not a partisan issue based on what I know. I mean, I've made the Speaker in the Pro Tem's office aware that this lawsuit's being filed today.
Anything else?
Okay, well, listen, thank you. If you can hang around, we should have petitions here just any minute. It was busy at the courthouse this morning. That's my excuse. Again, thank you all very much.